rooted in our being, so defining of our collective and personal existence that forfeiting our respective narratives would be a betrayal. And I asked the participants always, then why even bother, right? Why even bother sitting and writing this book if the narratives are never gonna, see each other, meet? And I guess that's my first question to you. Why even bother?
So, hi everybody. Is it safe to assume that everyone on this call has read the book? Great. Nina, thank you for really your wonderful work. I was very touched to hear the way in which you brought the book into the community, and really very grateful. And Rebecca, this is our last webinar. I feel like I've been commuting back and forth between Jerusalem and Detroit for the last 2 days. For me, this conflict is not about tangible issues, and I write this in the book. I say that it's. I think I wrote it in the book. The truth is, it's not always clear to me what I wrote in the book or what I say I should have written in the book. But I think I wrote that this conflict is really not about a line on a map. It's not about the tangible issues. The tangible issues of settlements, of holy places, refugees, those are all obviously crucial issues, but they are consequences of the conflict. They're not the root cause. The root cause of this conflict are intangible issues. The right to exist, memory, history, identity, the right to define yourself as a people, as a sovereign nation. These are the intangibles. Hello again, Howard. We're back again together. So this is really what I feel the conflict is about, and the intangible issues rarely get addressed. Certainly when the diplomats convene the negotiations, the relentless focus is on the practical issues, and that's understandable because that's what diplomats do. They look for the line on the map. They look for a rational solution. This is not a rational conflict. It goes much deeper. And by that, I don't mean that it's an irrational conflict. It's an irrational conflict. It's not about reason. It's about much deeper emotions and identities. And so if we ever do get to the point where, God willing, Palestinians and Israelis will be negotiating again for an agreement, we will need to have sitting around the table, not just diplomats, but psychologists, historians, theologians, spiritual leaders, because that's really the infrastructure of this conflict. That's what sustains this conflict. And I wrote this book because it's a conflict over narrative. And unless we start getting used to hearing each other's narratives and the legitimacy of each other's conflicting narratives, we're not going to be in a position where we're going to really be able to try to solve this. I spoke together with one of the Palestinian women who responded to the book, one of the letter writers. And by the way, have you all read the paperback edition with the Palestinian responses?
I'm sure some didn't, some didn't.
Ah, okay, so that's the wrong edition there. Oh, no, it's the right one, sorry.
It's the right one. This is the wrong one.
That's the wrong one.
But everything is online, or many of it.
Okay, great. So the edition that I'm referring to is the paperback that came out after the hardcover, and that has a new epilogue of 50 pages of Palestinian responses. And what I felt the need to do there was to model in one book what it would be like to have this respectful, passionate disagreement over conflicting and irreconcilable narratives. Our narratives will never converge. Israelis and Palestinians will never agree about what happened in 1948 and why, what happened in 1967 and why, or for that matter, who is responsible for the collapse of the peace process, or what happened last week at the Gaza border. We have totally different narratives. So how do you begin to have a process of reconciliation? And the gamble of this book, of this approach, is let's see what happens when we start to speak to each other about each other's conflicting narratives. And what would happen if an Israeli wrote a book explaining who we are to Muslims, translated into Arabic, offered it for free downloading, and started getting letters back. And then when I started getting these really interesting and complicated responses, I made the decision, and the next edition of the book, the paperback, with those Palestinian letters, with a counter narrative to my narrative, and not to respond. Now, I've responded personally, of course. I have very intense correspondence with many of the letter writers, but I gave them the last word in the book. And that really, I think, opens up the way for trust building, for respect. And it's very counterintuitive to this moment because, as we all know, the way politics is navigated these days, you're not supposed to be generous to your opponent. You're supposed to banquet your opponent. And I'll just if I could just tell one very quick story in connection with this. I spoke a couple of months ago in Cincinnati. This goes back now to November. And a woman stands up and says, I'm a Palestinian American, and I read your book, and I came here with a list. I have 6 pages of questions and challenges based on your narrative. But I wrote these 6 pages of questions before I knew about your new edition, before I knew that you gave the Palestinian narrative the last word in your book. And so I have no questions. Sat down. And that for me was such a moving moment, because it was really an affirmation of what can happen when you create a space in which you genuinely honor your ideological opponent. And so that's why I tried to model this as, but there's also something else here, which is I felt this deep need to explain the Jewish narrative, the Zionist narrative, to the Arab world, to my Palestinian neighbors, because astonishingly, in 100 years of conflict, no one on our side, no Israeli writer, has ever reached out, has ever written to our neighbors and said, listen, this is our story. You don't know our story.
So it's interesting that you say that, because it was we discussed about who the neighbor was in many of our gatherings, and who did you actually read the book, written the book to? In many ways, I felt personally like you wrote it to me, right? A Jewish Israeli, a shlicha who brings Israel to Jewish diaspora, but actually, to be honest, receives more than she gets. But really, at this point, we were talking about who the neighbor is, and when I told people I don't read well in English. I read okay. It's just slow and it's annoying. So I was looking for the book in Hebrew, and I couldn't find it. It doesn't exist in Hebrew. So I guess
not yet. It's on the
not
way.
yet. So my question to you is: so who is that neighbor? Is it just literally that your actual neighbor beyond the fence, or is it also other people? And when will Israelis get a chance to read it?
So I had 3 audiences in mind. The first and most important audience are my neighbors and the general Middle East, the region. And the second audience were American Jews, which is an audience that are my primary readers. Most of my readers tend to come from the American Jewish community. I've been writing from Israel for American Jews, Americans generally, but especially American Jews, for almost 40 years. I'm in a very funny position as an Israeli writing for my former community. And the third audience are Israelis. And the book has been translated into Hebrew. It's on its way. God willing, Be'ezrat Hashem, inshallah, it will come out after the summer in Hebrew. And in terms of the order of priority, the most important audience, as I say, were my Palestinian neighbors and Arabs generally. But I was very keenly aware of the fact, or hoping, that American Jews, and especially young American Jews, would be eavesdropping on my conversation with my neighbors, would also be reading this book. But I had to make a decision because these three audiences, Palestinians, American Jews, Israelis, these are very different audiences and very different sensibilities. And you need to write to them in very different ways. So I had to make a decision, who am I really writing to?
Okay.
And when I put that to myself, it was very clear to me that, of course, this book has to have credibility, first of all, to Palestinians and to Arabs and Muslims generally. It has to really sound like I'm writing to my Palestinian neighbor. Otherwise, it won't have credibility for anyone. And so I'll give you an example of one of the issues that I faced in trying to navigate these very different audiences. The question of religion, writing as a religious person. If I'm writing to a Palestinian, then it makes the most sense for me to write as a religious person, because my working assumption is that most Palestinians are, if not actively religious, certainly comfortable in a religious language. If you're writing for a Middle Eastern audience, you can't really separate religion. And I think it's one of the major flaws of the Israeli left, which is so relentlessly secular, that it doesn't know how to speak to the Middle East. It speaks to the Middle East as in a Western language. And my natural language is religious. And so it made the most sense for me, if I'm really speaking to my Palestinian neighbor, to speak as a religious Jew addressing a religious Muslim. Now, that religious language, which works so well in the Middle East, doesn't necessarily work very well for American Jews, especially young American Jews. And so if I were writing this book primarily for young American Jews, I might not use a religious language. And when I realized that that's the challenge here, I immediately made the decision, I must write this in a way that's authentic for my Palestinian neighbor. And some of the responses that I got from Palestinians validated that decision. I have one letter that I published in the new edition by a young man who grew up in Gaza and now lives in the States. And he wrote to me that this was the first time he was able to hear a Zionist narrative, because it was written from a religious perspective. And he said, that softened my heart. And it allowed me to enter into your story. And so one of the problems, there are many problems in this conflict. And some of them may not be within reach of solutions anytime soon. But one problem we can address is the language problem. We need to begin creating a language of reconciliation that is authentic for Israelis and Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims. And that's a language that's not necessarily a language that many Westerners are comfortable with.
Thank you. So the first question we have from the audience, which is a great opportunity to remind you that if you look at the bottom, it has a little chat box, and you can go there and just write your question to everyone, or privately to me or Rebecca. But the first question goes like this. Palestinian textbooks often teach hate of Israel and Jews at a young age, and it's sustained as they grow up. How can we help change that?
We have very limited reach. By we here, I don't necessarily mean only Israel. The international community has limited reach. Now, it has more leverage than it has used with Palestinian leaders. The Europeans in particular have been very slow, scandalously slow, in linking their aid to the Palestinian Authority with cleaning up some of the education for hatred that is endemic in the Palestinian Authority school system, as it is in some of the other educational systems in the Middle East. And so this notion of at the very least challenging Palestinian leaders is, I think needs to be part of the equation. Because what tends to happen even today is that Palestinian leaders are given a pass. And I don't think that Israeli leaders should be given a pass on expanding settlements. I want Netanyahu to be challenged by the international community about that. But at the same time, I want Palestinian leaders to be challenged about the ways in which they are making a two-state solution more difficult. And that is the systematic way in which they are raising one generation after another to hate the Jewish people and to deny the most basic legitimacy of Israel's existence.
Thank you, Yossi. One of the things that you do so impressively is acknowledge the humanity on both sides of the conflict. Sometimes American Jews think we have to make a choice between our Zionism and our belief in Palestinian rights. How can the diaspora community acknowledge that humanity on both sides of the conflict as you do so well?
I'll tell you what I need as an Israeli from American Jews. So I'm going to take a step back from the question and then approach it gradually. I need American Jews to be partners with me. And what that means is that I need their moral sensibilities, because when we live in an existential conflict here, it's very hard to have patience for the moral complexities of the conflict. We live under siege, we live under a sense of constant attack, and it's very hard to be morally sensitive and nuanced. And I need American Jewish partners to remind me of my responsibility, Jewish state, that speaks in the name of 4,000 years of Jewish history, values, that we have a responsibility not only to the security of the Jewish people, but also to upholding ethical values. That's half of the equation. I also need American Jews to understand what I'm up against in the Middle East. I need American Jews to be fully partners with me in Israeli vulnerability. Yes, it's true, we have the most powerful army in the Middle East, but we are vulnerable. We are vulnerable in the sense that we are alone in this region. And we have been under sustained attack from the day of our birth. And so what I really need from American Jewish partners are what I would say are partners in the anguish of the Israeli dilemma. The Israeli dilemma being, on the one hand, we must end the occupation for the sake of our souls, for the sake of Israel's Jewish democratic state. And on the other hand, we can't end the occupation because it would be too dangerous at this moment. And the partners that I need among American Jews are those who understand the full complexity of what I'm up against, who don't give me a pass, who challenge me to live up to Israel's own highest stated ideals. I want American Jews to say to me, look at the Declaration of Independence. How are you doing? Let's look at the reality for Arab Israelis. Let's look at the reality, that's a partnership. But at the same time, I need American Jews to understand why the overwhelming majority of Israelis today would oppose a withdrawal from the West Bank. Even those of us who believe deeply in a two-state solution know we can't do it anytime soon. So that's the kind of partnership that I need. But what I need from American Jews in terms of this conflict is, when American Jews reach out to Palestinians, and that happens, there's the Encounter program and others, that's fine, that's great. But American Jews need to do that mindful that they're also my partner in protecting Israel and keeping Israel safe. And that needs to be as much on the American Jewish agenda in encountering Palestinians that is for me when I encounter Palestinians. Not to lose your head and not to get too defensive and apologetic about the occupation, because we also have an argument about how we got to this point. And I need American Jews to understand what most Israelis take for granted, which is that we really did at different times try to make peace. And we got back the Second Intifada, we got back a wall of rejection, without letting Netanyahu off the hook. I need nuance. I need complexity from American Jews.
Thank you, Yossi. You mentioned the Declaration of Independence, and sometimes I feel like if we would bring the same document today to our Knesset, they wouldn't get 120 signatures on it.
For sure. It would be considered a left-wing document.
Exactly. You spoke a little bit about identities, and I hope you're not going to be offended by what I say, but sometimes, in some of the book clubs that came up, and I said, well, for me, in some way, Yossi is an outsider, right? Because you're not like me. You're an Orthodox Jew, American who made Aliyah. Though again, my parents also made Aliyah, and if I, God forbid, say they're Russian, all hell break loose. But maybe I feel like sometimes if you weren't in that position and if you weren't you wouldn't been able to write that book. If another somebody would write it, it wouldn't be accepted that way. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, so first of all, Nina, let me give you some bad news. To be in the Israel of today, to be a religious Jew is to be at least as much an insider as a secular Jew, maybe more.
100%.
That's changed. That's really changed. The second point is you're certainly right. I would call myself an insider outsider. I really feel that I have both of those perspectives. I mean, 40 years in Israel is really a long time, but it is 40 years, and I was formed in America. And the fact that I was formed in America and that I grew up in the America of the 1960s in particular really shaped my worldview, and it shaped my sense of what I expect of Israel. And I mean, look, I also, as I wrote in the book, I also grew up in the home of a Holocaust survivor. So I didn't grow up in Berkeley, I absorbed the values of the 60s, but those were filtered through the very particular family experience that I was growing up in. And so in that sense, I always felt that I belonged more in Israel actually than in America, than within the American Jewish community. because coming from a Holocaust survivor background made me an outsider among American Jews. Certainly in the 60s and 70s, before the Holocaust became a more mainstream, a more normative part of American Jewish identity. In those years, we, the Holocaust survivor families, felt very peripheral to American Jewish life. That obviously changed over the years. And so I was never fully a part of America, and I was never fully part of Israel, which for a writer is actually not a bad thing. Because as a writer, you really have you need something of a detached perspective. And you know the Israeli writer, journalist Tom Segev. For many years, he had a column in Haaretz called Katav Zar, foreign correspondent. And I really understood that, you know, that, well, yeah, I'm an Israeli, but I'm writing about Israel from a detached place. Now, I don't write about Israel as a foreign correspondent. I write very much as someone who has fully thrown his lot in with Israel. And yet there is always a part of me as a writer that is detached. So in that sense, I would say, yes, I'm an American, and maybe that has had some influence on my commitment to try to continue the conversation. That's a kind of an American approach. Why can't we talk? On the other hand, you know, I think that my sensibility and bringing an Israeli attitude toward toward an American framework of a conversation. And we'll see, you know, when the book comes out in Hebrew, we'll see how that goes. I can't say that I'm really looking forward to it, because a book that, you know, outreach, Shlomit, you share my pain. You know, to come out with, look, I think of myself 10 years ago, after the Second Intifada. If I had seen a book like this, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, I would have thought, give me a break. You don't have a Palestinian neighbor. They don't consider themselves your neighbor. You're at war. Get real. There's nothing to talk about. We tried to make a deal, etc., etc. And so I know what I'm stepping into here. You know, betoch ami ani yoshev. I live among my people, and I know how this is going to be received.
Well, you have a lot of Israelis on your side. a lot of shlichim who get it.
I think that I will be pleasantly surprised. I will not be unpleasantly surprised, because I'm expecting really bad reactions from the right.
Following what you said, another question was, do you find one or more letters is missing? Should there be an Israeli apology to Palestinians, for example?
What was the first part of the question?
Do you find one or more letters missing?
Should there be an Israeli apology to the Palestinians? Yes, but not before we reach an agreement. It should be in the context of an agreement, and it will not be the only apology on the table. The way that I would envision an exchange of apologies is Israel apologizes for the suffering of the Palestinians, for the shattering of the Palestinian people. And in return, we get an apology from the Arab world, not from the Palestinians, because I don't think that psychologically the Palestinians will ever be capable of apologizing to us. They lost. And the losers in a conflict cannot apologize. But the Arab world, which repeatedly tried to destroy us, which effectively expelled 1 million Jews who come from communities that predated Islam, that go back 2,000, in some cases in Iraq, 2,500 years, Yemen, 2,000 years, Egypt, 2,500 years. And these communities disappeared within 20 years. We, the Jewish people, need an apology from the Arab world. And that's the trade-off of apologies that I would suggest. If the Arab League will not give us an apology, then Israelis will be in no frame of mind to apologize to the Palestinians.
Well, I guess another question that follows that was, if you believe it is possible for Israelis and Palestinians to be partners in building peace, what do you think that might look like in the current landscape, or does the landscape have to change?
Israelis and Palestinians, for the foreseeable future, are incapable of reaching an agreement. I think we need to internalize that. So if you're asking me, do I have any hope? My answer is, for the foreseeable future, no. But I have no hope of the Israelis and Palestinians reaching a breakthrough. But there are other developments happening that might give me some hope. And I'm speaking specifically about the changes in the region. In the last few years, we have seen something inconceivable, and that is the emergence of an Israeli-Arab strategic relationship, in particular, the Saudis, the Gulf states, to some extent Egypt, less so Jordan. And that is an alliance of fear against Iran. Iran today effectively controls 4 Arab countries: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The rest of the Arab world is terrified of a resurgent, expansive Iran. My hope is that the emerging strategic relationship that's bringing Israel and a large part of the Arab world together can eventually grow into a political relationship. And then we can begin to see a trade-off where the Arab world offers Israel normalization, economic relations, recognition, in exchange for a Palestinian state. That's a trade-off that I, as an Israeli, would be very willing to consider. In terms of a 2-state solution, a trade-off with the Palestinians, first of all, the Palestinians have nothing to offer Israel. All they can offer Israel is promises for peace. And Israelis will not believe those promises. But if you bring in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, you bring them to the table, and with their economic clout, with their political clout, say, okay, we're taking responsibility here for a 2-state solution. Here's what we are going to offer Israel in exchange for an Israeli withdrawal. Now, it cannot work, I don't know. But if you look at the Trump plan and leave the details of the Trump plan aside, conceptually, the Trump plan is right. And that is that you must bring in the Arab world as guarantors, and that what Israel will get in return for a withdrawal will not be promises of peace from Mahmoud Abbas. It will be a Saudi embassy. It will be a Saudi trade mission. It will be Israeli business people going to the Gulf states. That's the deal. And if it's framed in that way, and for the first time I think that is a conceivable deal, then we're in a different situation.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because we did speak about, who's at the who should be around the table. We definitely spoke about it in some of our meetings. As a follow-up question, I guess, one of the people who sent me an email said, do you think we'll have to wait for the next generation of leaders before any movement toward peace can be made? Or you think the changes you just said can be actually made now?
No, I think that if we wait for the next generation of leaders, then nothing's going to happen. Because the next generation of Israelis and Palestinians are far more hardline than my generation. My generation still may be disillusioned with peace, but had hopes for peace. This next generation is in despair on both sides. And look, the Israeli, your generation. And this is not a generation that that imagines peace. that even longs for peace because it doesn't believe that peace is possible. This is a generation that grew up after the peace failed, after the collapse of peace.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a generation that went from suicide bombings to missiles to one mini war after the other. Every 2 years, we have a little war somewhere. Usually with Gaza, it can be in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
We have actually a little war going on with Iran and Syria now, which at any moment could break out into a major war. And so I can't afford to leave this to the next generation. It has to be the generation that once believed that peace is possible. We need a new avenue to peace, a much more hard-headed, security-minded avenue. We need partners outside of the Palestinian leadership who nobody on our side trusts for good reason, just as I think the Palestinians have good reason not to trust this current Israeli leadership. There is no trust on either side, and both sides have earned that lack of trust. And so we need as well, this is the modest contribution, and I don't say that with false humility. It's an accurate description of this project, my book. It is a modest contribution to trying to create a model, a language for how Israelis and Palestinians can start speaking about peace, using religion, drawing on each other's narratives, accepting each other's maximalist dreams as legitimate, even if those maximalist dreams can't be fulfilled. These are the elements that I play with in the book. And so we need to, at this moment, in the next few years, we need to try again, but in a different way. So no, not to wait to the next generation.
Well, I guess the difference would be authors sitting around the discussion table and not politicians.
Yeah. I mean, that I've had mixed results with that one.
I'm sure.
My book was reviewed in the New York Times book review by a Palestinian writer, Raja Shahada, who hated the book and in many ways misrepresented the book. And so, but I have had responses from other Palestinian writers, which I include in the book, which were much more willing to engage.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, in principle, poets should be at the table, absolutely.
Another question asked about, do you ever feel conflicted about living in French Hill, about living in East Jerusalem, and how you feel about the possibility of East Jerusalem being the future capital of a Palestinian state?
So, in the building that I live in, number 15 Hachayil Street, which is where I'm sitting now, about 40% of the families are Arab Israeli, Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now that's relatively new, that's the last few years. And so my question to people, and I get this a fair bit about living in French Hill. My counter question is it legitimate for Palestinians who are citizens of Israel to live in this neighborhood? But is it not legitimate for Jews who are citizens of Israel to live here? This is an Israeli neighborhood, which means that Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians can move here. And more, that's what's happening. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that my Palestinian Israeli neighbors, who feel very comfortable living in French Hill, would never move 15 minutes down the road to Ma'ale Adumim, which is a settlement. It's 15 minutes away from here. But the difference between French Hill and Ma'ale Adumim is very clear to Arab Israelis. Ma'ale Adumim is a settlement. I would never, as an Arab Israeli, move there. I wouldn't probably be welcome there either. But French Hill is an Israeli neighborhood. And everybody knows, every Israeli knows that the post-67 Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, which have close to 300,000 Israelis living in them, everyone knows that these neighborhoods are here to stay. In fact, in the negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians over the years, that was always a given, that the Jewish neighborhoods would be under Israeli control, the Palestinian neighborhoods would be part of the Palestinian state. That was the Clinton proposals. French Hill is an interesting case because it's Arab and Jewish, but it's actually all Israeli. The Palestinians living in French Hill are Israeli Palestinians. So no, I don't have any conflict, no conflicted emotions. I never think about French Hill as not being part of Israel. And my Palestinian neighbors, literally my next door neighbor, my neighbor upstairs, reinforce that sense of normalcy, of Israeli normalcy. That's an argument that the UN is still holding on to, but that argument was lost a long time ago. 50 years since the Six-Day War have passed. 50 years is a very long time in the modern world. And we've gone through 2 generations, almost 3 generations. And what's the expression? That horse has left the stable, something like that. Yeah, that's gone.
I got that one in Hebrew.
If it's not a Hebrew expression.
Maybe
I knew I heard it. I knew I heard it somewhere.
As Rebecca said in the chat, if people see, the ship has sailed, Carol says. We have a few, I guess we have time for a few more questions. So I'm going to ask mine, and then if anyone else has any more questions, you're welcome to write it down. Again, as an Israeli, I guess, I read the book, and throughout the different conversations I had in the community, I was trying to bring it back home and try and understand what is my responsibility, right? Coming back home now, I said in different occasions, I feel I'm finishing my shlichut here in the summer after 3 years, and it feels like I came more Israeli, but I'm going back more Jewish. In many ways, I feel like Israel took away my opportunity to be Jewish the way I'm Jewish here. And I'm sure you'll get it. I see Shlomit nodding because she gets it.
Where did you grow up, Nina?
I grew up in Kochav Yair.
Nice place.
In a very Zionist home, and we spoke about it in the last book club that we had, that my parents made the Aliyah not because they were Jewish. I mean, they were obviously, but because they were well, I guess my question to you is, what is our responsibility as Israelis, with regards to Jewish diaspora? You spoke a bit earlier about what do you expect from American Jews? What do you expect from us Israelis as a society?
I think American Jews have the right to expect 2 things from us. One is that even when we deal with excruciating security dilemmas, we don't give ourselves an easy way out, and that we don't betray our responsibility to struggle between security and morality. That we not necessarily, I don't think that outsiders, even American Jews, have the right to expect of us to always get it right. We're going to make mistakes, but I think you do have the right to expect of us that we continue to be engaged in that struggle. We don't give up the commitment, try to figure out how to live reasonably ethical lives, even in the middle of sometimes unbearable tension. The second thing that I think American Jews have the right to expect of us and to demand of us, is that we live up to the promise of Zionism, which was to create a state that would reflect the diversity of the Jewish people, where any Jew could feel that the state was in some way an extension of their Jewishness. And that means that you don't hand over the keys to Judaism to one part of the Jewish people. And you certainly don't hand over the keys to Judaism, to official state Judaism, if you're already going to have such an animal called a state religion. You don't hand the keys over to the most anti-pluralistic part of the Jewish people, the ultra-Orthodox. And that is an act of anti-Zionism, to exclude to delegitimize the religious practices of half of the Jewish people is a crime against Zionism. And I always say that when I speak to liberal Jews, liberal Jewish leaders, I say, don't talk to Israelis about religious pluralism. They don't understand. Religious pluralism doesn't speak to Israelis. And for a very simple reason. A majority, the strong majority of Israeli Jews come from families that have origins in two places, either in Eastern Europe or the Middle East. And neither of those Jewish communities knew religious pluralism. And so it's a foreign concept. But speak to Israelis about Jewish unity, about Jewish peoplehood, about Jewish inclusivity, about the promise of Zionism. That's a conversation that many Israelis would understand. And so those are the two responsibilities, I would argue, that we have as a Jewish and democratic state to American Jews. And maybe the last thing I'll say there is that we have a responsibility to be both a Jewish state and a democratic state. Really, and that's not easy. Really, those are two difficult identities. But we are commanded by the Israeli Declaration of Independence. We are mandated to live in that tension between Jewish and
which I guess leads me to the next question that doesn't relate directly to the book, but it was raised, and again, you're welcome to address it or not. It is, maybe you can explain what is going on with the attempt to form a new government. I'm not sure if anyone can explain that, neither the people who are actually trying to form the government, but if you want to take the challenge.
So I won't deal with the technicalities. I just want to say one thing that I think is really significant, something very important, even historic, has happened in the last few days, and we need to pay attention to it. And that is that for the first time in the history of Israeli politics, you have the Arab side and the Jewish side talking about creating some kind of a government together. Now, it's awkward on both sides. There's a lot of ambivalence on both sides. And we could spend the next 2 hours talking about all of the reasons why each side is ambivalent here. Just very briefly, on the Arab side, you have a very difficult situation, I would say an anomaly really, where a majority of the Arab Israelis are more integrationist than they are Palestinian nationalists. They feel, many of them feel Palestinian. Almost all of them strongly support Palestinian aspirations. But a majority of Arab Israelis are comfortable defining themselves as Arab Israelis and not as Palestinian Israelis. And they want to be integrated into this society. The leadership, the political leadership that represents them in the Knesset is much more nationalist than integrationist. That creates tension with the Israeli Jewish political system, which doesn't trust them. And for good reason, because we have Arab Knesset members who have supported Hezbollah, Hamas. We've had expressions of support for terrorism. And I don't trust most of the Arab political leadership, but I very much want to bring the Arab Israeli community into the mainstream. And so we have to figure out, how do you do that in a way where you can create some kind of working relationship with leaders whom you don't trust, who represent a constituency that I want to trust? That's this complicated moment. But for the first time, you have a major party in Israel treating the Arab parties, it's one Arab party, but it's an umbrella of 4 parties, United Arab List, treating the Arab political bloc as a legitimate partner. This is something we've never seen before. Now, the Israeli right, chief among them Netanyahu, are trying to delegitimize this. And they're playing on those Jewish fears of which to some extent are legitimate, about the loyalty of the Arab Knesset members. The problem is that Netanyahu is also shifting that into implicitly questioning the loyalty and participation of the Arab Israeli community. It's a very difficult moment, but a very interesting moment. And as someone who writes about Israel, difficult moments are actually good because they make for very interesting writing. Again, speaking as somebody who's a little bit detached as a writer, as an observer of Israeli reality, this is a great moment.
So we have one last question, and it is, in your book, you talk about the idea that there can be a land of Israel and a state of Israel, as well as a land of Palestine and a state of Palestine, all at the same time. This is an image that most people can't understand. Can you comment on your thoughts about this?
Yeah, what I'm trying to do here is separate the notion that the state of Israel must completely overlap with the land of Israel, and that the state of Palestine must completely overlap with the land of Palestine. In other words, between the river and the sea, the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there is one physical land, but 2 conceptual lands. It is, for Palestinians, all of it, the land of Palestine, and it is, for Jews, all of it, the land of Israel. This one physical piece of land is conceptually 2 very different territories. And so we need to figure out a way of separating, separating the historical attachments that both peoples have to all of the land to a practical political solution, which is partition. Now, if I insist, as the Israeli right does, that the state of Israel must encompass the whole land of Israel, then that doesn't leave any place for territorial compromise. If I'm a Palestinian maximalist and I say, well, it's all Palestine, Haifa, Jaffa, what you consider the state of Israel is just, for me, it's historic Palestine, and there's nothing to negotiate. So my starting point, and this is something that we have never done in negotiations, I believe that the starting point needs to be where Palestinians and Israelis sit at the table and each one frankly presents their maximalist position. For me, it's all mine. Well, for you, it's also all yours. What do we do now? We either have another 100 years of war, or we figure out how to do something that neither of us wants to do, because we both know that the land belongs to us. It's mine. How can I give up what's mine? Well, we also know in real life that, as the Rolling Stones taught us, you can't always get what you want. And that's part of growing up. That's part of owning responsibility for your life. What's true in our own personal lives needs to be true in our national lives. We can't always get what we want. And we're going to need to accept the fact that there's another people sitting in this land. The one last point that I'll say is that I never speak of Israel giving back occupied territory, because for me, it's not occupied territory. It's the land of Israel. It's mine. What I do speak about is the need to give up something that's mine for the sake of peace. In the same way that Palestinians are going to have to give up something that's theirs, which is the land of Palestine, the part of Palestine that we call the state of Israel. They're going to have to give up Haifa and Jaffa. And the only way that peace can really work is both sides realize that each side is giving up something that it believes deeply belongs to them.
Thank you for that. I will finish, you mentioned ownership, and I think that's what I'm taking from from this whole conversation, to be able to own a narrative, but at the same time to understand or appreciate or acknowledge, even if I disagree with someone else's narrative. And I think that
You got it. You summed it up.
It is what it is at this point. Thank you so much for this. I wish we could have done it in person.
Truly a pleasure. Me too.
And I'm sure you'll come here, and I won't be here, but maybe we'll meet in Israel. But
look me up, Nina. I'd be delighted to continue the conversation.
Me too, legamre. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who took the time and participated. I know it's not easy. I know some of you have, like myself, 3 children at home, but I really appreciate it. And Rebecca, thank you for being the mind behind all of this. So
thank you so much.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
Pleasure
Rebecca,
to
you're
engage
in mute.
with you.
You wanted to say something?
Oh, I just want to say thank you, and I wanted to make sure you all knew that there were 40 people on this interesting, wonderful conversation. So
nice.
I know that we are needing each other. So thank you for coming
Great.
and showing up. And thank you, Yossi. Thank you.
Take care. Keep well, everybody.
Be well and healthy.
You too.